Hello everyone, Miss Hannon here. So today I'm going to be introducing a new unit about ecology. And ecology is the study of interaction between the biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living, components of an ecosystem. So we have a couple different pictures of ecologists all over the world studying organisms and how they interact with their environment in all kinds of different ecosystems. So there's a wide range of things that we can study with ecology. So here is a little flow chart of some topics that we're going to cover in ecology. We're going to start with these topics highlighted in green. So we're going to introduce some new vocabulary words and talk about how energy is taken in from the sun by organisms and then transferred to different organisms in food chains and food webs. So let's start with a few new vocabulary words here that I just mentioned in that definition of ecology. Biotic and abiotic. So biotic factors in an ecosystem are the living parts of an ecosystem. That prefix bio means life. Okay, so these are living parts of an ecosystem. Things like plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, anything alive. Abiotic factors are non-living parts of an ecosystem. When you see an A in front of a word, usually that means opposite. So this is the opposite of living things, right? Non-living things. So things like rock, sand, sunlight, precipitation, weather, water, air, wind, climate, temperature, all of those non-living things that can affect the living things in an ecosystem. So let's take a look at this picture for a second and see if we can identify some of the biotic and abiotic things in this little ecosystem. Okay, now we're going to talk about some new vocabulary words. These are the levels of organization. So different words to categorize the different levels in which we organize things in ecology. So we're going to start with the individual, then move to the population, which is the second biggest, community, ecosystem, biome, and eventually biosphere. So an organism, an individual organism, is just an individual plant, animal, bacteria, any individual living thing that we're talking about. A population is when there's many of those individuals. So all of one species living in the same area makes up a population. A community is all of the interacting organisms, so the biotic factors in one area. So we have that population of elephants that we just looked at, but now all the other living things in that area as well. So the zebra, the grass, the trees, all the other living components in that area are called the community. The ecosystem, now we're talking about the biotic and biotic factors found in the same area. So we have the animals, right? The population of elephants, the population of zebra, the trees, the grass. But now we have the non-living components as well. So we have the mountains in the background, the air, the precipitation, the water, all of those things as well make up the ecosystem. Next, we have the biome. So these are ecosystems with similar biotic and abiotic factors found in different areas of the world. So deserts, for example, we've got some deserts in the Southwest United States. There are some in Northern Africa, some in Asia, some in Australia. So it's the same, similar biotic and abiotic factors, right? Similar climate, similar type of organism, but they're found in different areas around the world. So that's what a biome is. And then lastly, we have the biosphere, which is just the area on Earth where all life exists. Okay, so individual, again, the smallest level. So we got one little froggy here. Population is all the same species that live in the same area. Community, all the living things that live in that area. Ecosystem is the living and the non-living things in the area. Skipped biome here. But the biosphere is all the area on Earth where life exists. Now let's take a second and do some practice questions. See if you can identify the level of organization of each of these pictures. The lion would be an individual organism, right? It's just one. The family of buffalo, we're talking about all the same species that live in an area, so that would be a population. And if we're talking about the Serengeti Plains, we're talking about all the animals, all the plants, all the non-living things, the dust, the water, the air. So this would be an ecosystem, Serengeti Plains. Okay. Now let's try to make the connection between energy and ecosystems. So how does energy flow through food webs? We're going to see in a second. So it all starts with producers, right? We already learned that producers are plants that use photosynthesis to harness energy from the sun, turn it into carbohydrates that the plant can contain and store as energy, right? Producers of energy-rich carbohydrates that are later used by other organisms in an ecosystem. They're also called autotrophs, right? They automatically make their own food. And they're the base of every food web. So common examples that we're familiar with would be plants and algae. There's also some bacteria at the bottom of the ocean that can do this with chemicals as well. So again, producers are the most common producers are plants and algae, which we'll talk about most frequently. They use energy from the sun to create carbohydrates in that process called photosynthesis, which we just learned about. So producers store energy as carbohydrates, which other organisms get when they are consumed. So therefore, the producers are essential for the flow of energy in the biosphere, right? They're the base of every food chain. It all starts with the producer. They harness the energy from the sun, store it as carbohydrates so that it can pass to the consumers when they get eaten. Okay, so now let's look at different types of consumers, and I know you've learned these words in middle school, so I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. But a consumer is an organism that gets energy from other organisms by ingesting or eating. So they need to eat things to survive, right? So they're also called heterotrophs, right? Plants are autotrophs, consumers are heterotrophs. Some examples are carnivores, herbivores, decomposers, which we'll get into in a second. All right, first type of consumer, carnivore, right? If anyone speaks Spanish or Portuguese or any of the Latin languages, carne means meat, right? So these are meat eaters. Vor means to eat, so meat eaters. These are animals that kill and eat other animals for food. So things like lions, wolves, snakes, hawks, anything that's actively killing and eating another animal for food. Herbivores, right? Think herbs are plants, right? So these are things that eat plants. Animals that consume producers. So deer, rabbits, cows, caterpillars, anything that is eating a producer. Then we've got omnivores. That word omni means all. So these guys eat everything. So like most humans, unless you're a vegetarian, bears, pigs, anything that eats both plants and animals is an omnivore. Then we've got scavengers. So these are the guys who consume the carcasses that other animals already killed, or they died by natural causes. So they're not doing the hunting, they're just kind of doing the cleaning up. So they're still eating meat, but it's not meat that they actively killed. So they're scavenging. Another really important part of the food chain are decomposers. So these are organisms that feed by chemically breaking down organic matter. So dead stuff, right? If you throw a banana peel on the side of the road, it doesn't stay there forever, right? It decomposes. And these are the organisms that do that. So this process produces a product called detritus, which are small pieces of dead and decaying plant and animal remains. So these are guys like fungi and bacteria. Really important. Otherwise, we would just have a buildup of dead stuff on the planet. And then lastly, so the decomposers make detritus, detritivores eat that detritus. So they eat the partially decomposed plant and animal parts. So again, these guys are really important. Things like earthworms, slugs, certain crabs, starfish are all detritivores. All right, so energy flows in one direction through the biosphere, from the producer to the consumer. Okay, it flows in one direction. It's not a cycle. Energy isn't a cycle. It eventually runs out. And that's generally why you don't see more than 4 or 5 organisms usually per food chain, right? Eventually the animals at the top don't taste very good, right? Because there's that carbohydrate gets lost. So you really don't see things that are eating these top predators because they don't taste good. There's not as much energy in their meat. Whereas those primary consumers and secondary consumers, there's a lot more energy because they're closer to the actual producer. So they taste better. Okay, so a food chain are these diagrams that I know you've studied in middle school, is the diagram that shows energy being passed through an ecosystem. So they always start with some kind of producer, and the arrows are showing the direction that the energy is flowing. So it's really important when you guys start drawing your own food webs and food chains to show the energy going from the producer to the consumer, or from the thing that's being eaten to the eater, right? Another way to think of it as the arrow says is eaten by. Okay, so the plant is eaten by the snail. The snail is eaten by the bird. Okay, or you can think of it as like going into the mouth of the consumer. Okay, so make sure your arrows are going in the right direction. And then when we put a bunch of food chains together in the same ecosystem, we get what's called a food web. So this kind of shows all the feeding relationships in one ecosystem. All right, so I hope this was helpful, and if you have questions, please write them down and ask when you get to class. See you next time.